Hi, and welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy, a proud member of the Sightcraft Network. The goal of this podcast is to demystify therapy, what can happen in therapy, and the wide array of conversations you can have in and about therapy. Through personal experiences, guests will talk about therapy, their experiences with it, and how psychology and therapy are present in many places in their lives, with lots of authenticity and a touch of humor. Here is your host, Steve Bisson.
Ça sonne tellement professionnel. It sounds so professional. Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 143 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. If you haven't listened to episode 142 with Laura Long, please and go listen to it. It was a great interview. I really enjoyed her. I've met her on another podcast that I was on. She was amazing, so I hope you enjoyed the interview. But episode 143 is a returning guest, and the returning guest is Liz Kelly. Liz Kelly is someone I knew from another company that I worked for a while, and we really got along while we were there, and I really enjoyed her company, and I'm hoping that you enjoy her book. This book is cheaper than therapy. She's going to talk about that and among other things. So right before we go to the interview, just hear a brief note on getfree.ai, and with code Steve50, you get $50 off your first month. So please go and listen. Hey there, everyone. You've known me to host this podcast for about 130 something episodes before I put actually any type of commercials on here. And I'm looking right now at my healthcare professionals looking to have a real impact with their clients. I really enjoyed this product, and I've actually used it personally. And that is why, which is very important for me to tell you, because that's why I want to share this. I want to introduce Freed, F-R-E-E-D, Freed. The app that listens, transcribes, writes your medical documentations for you. With Freed, you can pay attention to your clients, do things with your clients, and not be distracted by making sure you're writing notes. What also helps with this app is that the note is saved for about 10 days. And it does disappear, it no longer is there after a while. So writing down those notes is no longer your responsibility. The AI Freed will write the note for you and create a progress note for you. But it goes also beyond that. And what I really like about it is that it can help you set goals, and it even creates a letter. You can make any type of edit to it, and there's actually a button now for it to learn how you write your own notes. So maybe the first few days you set it up so that your Freed can recognize your note-taking process and how you want to create a progress note, either SOAP or what have you. And it really helps you with that. And the best part, it's very affordable. I really think that at $99 a month, you'll have access to what helps your practice. And I can tell you from personal experience, taking notes, writing down the goals, writing down any type of letter a client might need, that usually takes me, I don't know, it takes me a lot of time during a week. Maybe I used to do my notes on Sunday, and it used to take me about 3 hours. Now, I think that if it takes me an hour, that's surprising. And when you think about Freed.ai, it's very affordable. For just $99 a month, you can access everything that I just talked about. If you pay for the whole year, you actually save 10%, which is what I did, and I'm looking forward to continuing to use it. And because you hear this podcast, you're my friend, someone I know, I have a little treat for you. You can use the code STEVE50. Again, Steve, S-T-E-V-E 50. And you'll get $50 off your first month. That's right, more value for your money. I don't want you to miss out on how to get your practice going and give yourself a freedom to pay attention to what's important. Why we did this job is to pay attention to the client. So download Freed today. Don't forget to use my code STEVE50 for $50 off the first month. And let's make a difference in our clients' lives and make sure we can pay attention to them. Remember, with Freed, your clients always come first. Well, hi, everyone, and just so happy to see a returning guest. Liz Kelly was on episode 125. And, at the time she was completing the editing process of her book And the book is, if you go to YouTube, you will see it. This book is cheaper than therapy. I should probably just cut the top because that top is only for me. But basically, this is a book that Liz wrote, and I really enjoyed reading it. I actually read everything. You know me, guys. You've heard me 100 times. If I didn't read the whole book when I have an author, I said the truth. I read the whole book. I honestly will give it a 5-star review. I will give it I also will tell you that if you want to get a good book to give you the basis of pretty much everything I do in therapy, it's like Liz was present in my sessions. So we'll talk about plagiarism later, but all joking aside, Liz, welcome again to Finding Your Way Through Therapy.
Hey, thanks so for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
I after I got your book and I've been reading it off and on, and it was just fascinating to me that it was just exactly what I talk about with a lot of my clients. And I'm jumping in already, and then I'm like, oh, you know what? People might have missed episode 125. So maybe, Liz, if you want to do a quick introduction, please go ahead.
Sure, I would be happy to. So I'm a therapist in the DC metro area. I live in Northern Virginia. I've been in the mental health field for about 13 years. This is actually a second career for me. I used to do, fundraising development, so I know what it's like to kind of live in that hectic corporate, fast-paced world. So I've done so I did a career switch. I went and became a licensed clinical social worker, and have been in the field for a while. And a couple years ago, during the pandemic, I realized that I was so excited that so many people were interested in getting mental health services. That was so nice to see therapy being normalized and people really understanding that this is a helpful, necessary tool. But there was this disappointment that even though so many people wanted to go to therapy, there still is a lack of access and a lack of resources for a lot of folks. So I thought, I can't change our entire mental health system overnight on my own, but I can write a book and put the things that I talk to my clients about in the book. And so then that's when I also added author to my to my job title as well.
Well, that's awesome. And we were working together at the pandemic, if you remember correctly. And
Right,
we were doing these online meetings, and we knew the need for the therapy, but unfortunately, we knew that the affordability wasn't always there.
right.
So it's a great book. I like the disclosure you make right off the top. Like, I'm not saying don't go to therapy, but with all due respect to that, I get it. But as this is like the incorporation of about 25 or so books that I've read in my life into one simple book. So even if you said don't go to therapy, I'd say, well, you invest in that book, you'll save yourself about 25 other books at 15 to 20 bucks a piece. So it's a very affordable book when you really think about it that way.
Oh, thanks. And just to let your listeners know that this book is, I don't include self-help jargon, or I tried to avoid that as much as possible. I tried to avoid psychology buzzwords. I just wanted to explain what happens in therapy in everyday language. I throw in a few swear words when warranted, because I think a few F-bombs are necessary for managing the messiness of life. I put that in my disclosure right away. So it's very conversational, very approachable. It is, to a certain extent, mental health 101. So if you are someone who, has been really invested in mental health for a long time, you may be really familiar with a lot of these concepts. But if you're new to therapy, if you're curious about it, this is, very much a mental health 101. And I try to use, humor along with compassion and practical strategies so that you can come away from this book being able to make changes right away.
Well, you can always swear on my podcast. Just remember that, number one,
Awesome.
because I believe in authenticity. That's the other reason why I had you back on. And frankly, Liz, that's why I always loved you, because you were yourself. I know that we were in meetings with other people, but I got glimpses of that. Uh,
Thanks.
I
I think I
appreciate that.
realized about myself that I don't tend to swear a lot in everyday conversation, but I think I swear a lot in my head. And so that's why it came out when I was writing the book. So there you go.
I don't remember you ever swearing per se when we worked together, but hey, I don't really care. So I please feel free. The other thing that I will say to people is, if you read this book, not only will you get a lot of tricks, you get a little bit of insight on Liz. And I really appreciate these little insight on you that I learned, and truly appreciate, the the journey you've been on, the feminist side of you, because as a feminist myself, it's a very important thing. I have two girls now, so even if I wasn't a feminist before, I damn right am right now. But I really appreciate those little glimpses inside of who you are.
Right. Like I value authenticity as well. So when I was writing, it just everything I shared are things that I'm comfortable people with others knowing about me. So I was very thoughtful about what I shared in the book, and I feel very comfortable with what I shared, but and I felt like what I shared was necessary to, illustrate the book. And I'm also very respectful of my clients. And so, I all of the illustrations of the book or the client stories are composites. So I'm not using any person's individual story. It's basically like fictionalized accounts of what my work with clients look like.
Well, thank you for protecting my identity in your book. I appreciate that. But all joking aside, what I really want to know, and I'm not going to spoil the book for you guys at all, but I want to give you good glimpses of my personal parts that I really loved. And the first person I want to know about, Liz, is actually not you. I want to know about Nelson. And
Okay.
who is Nelson? And Nelson's across this book, guys. You'll see it. And maybe you'll get it once Liz gives it an explanation. But Liz, why is it? Who's Nelson?
Okay, so that's a great question. Nelson is very present in the book, and Nelson is the name that I gave to my inner critic. And everybody's got an inner critic. That's that little voice in your head that's trying to put you down and criticize you and hold you back and belittle you. Our inner critics can be really harsh sometimes. And so, in order to be able to interact with my inner critic a little differently and be able to push back against my inner critic more effectively, I gave my inner critic a name. And so I decided to call my inner critic Nelson. And that's no offense to anybody out there named Nelson. I'm sure there's a lot of lovely people out there named Nelson. And if you want to name your inner critic Liz, that's totally okay with me. Got no problem with that. But by giving my inner critic a name, it kind of makes it a little funny. So, if I'm going about my day and I make a mistake and my inner critic says, like, gosh, you're such an idiot, or like, you're so stupid, or you're so, you're lazy, you should be doing more. Like, these are things that my inner critic tends to say a lot. And so I can, now in my head, I can say, back off, Nelson, I'm doing the best I can, or back off, Nelson, like my productivity is not tied to my self-worth. And so now I can start to start to push back a little bit more effectively. And
No,
what I realized, and what I also talk about in the book, is that our inner critics don't mean to be such jerks. They don't mean to be that, to be so horrible to us. But what our inner critic is actually our brain trying to protect us from pain, embarrassment, rejection, from getting hurt. It's trying, our inner critics is focused on keeping us alive. Our inner critic doesn't want us to do anything that's going to reject us from belonging. And so that's why our inner critics are so active. And so our inner critics mean well, but they just, in our modern world, they don't get it quite right.
I mean, I like Nelson telling you how to dress. I like how Nelson tells you how to show up. I like how Nelson tells you how to live your life, essentially. But, I think that it is a protective factor. It's just a protective factor that we got to talk back to once in a while.
Right, because our inner critics tend to go overboard, and they want to keep us safe at a cost to connection and a cost to love and a cost to us being able to live authentically. So we have to make sure that our inner critics aren't overstepping.
Which they typically do, right? I mean, that's
Mhm.
just how it is.
Right, for sure.
One of the things that I also liked about your book is that at the end of each chapter, there's a little action
Like little questions or
action
action items, or
action
yeah.
items. That's what I was looking for the word. I'm like, but those action items are very good and good. Like to me, they're almost like they're like a workbook type of thing too, where people can read the chapter. Um, can you tell me more about what thought process was in regards to those action items?
Right. Well, I don't know about you, but I love to read. I love to read books on self-help. I love to read books on psychology and mental health. But more times than I can count, I've come away from books and been like, well, that was a great book, but I don't know how to apply any of these things to my life.
Right.
Or I really like those concepts, but then you read about it, then you close the book and then you forget about it. And so I wanted, for people who were inspired or who wanted to journal or who wanted to think further on what steps that they could take, I wanted to give some direction in terms of how you could deepen your experience with the book. And those, action items are completely optional. I didn't want to make it like, I didn't want to imply that like, oh, to have a good experience with this book, you have to do these things. Like, you don't have to do these things, but if you do want to take your experience further, it's an option to be able to reflect on these items or these questions.
No, my inner critic Liz told me that I have to do it or I'm a loser. So, but I talked back. I didn't do them all. But no, I
Yeah,
think,
well, tell your inner critic that you can do the ones that speak to you, and that's plenty.
and let's not forget a couple of action items, even within chapters. I think that there's a few of them like questions to ask yourself, which I really thought was brilliant too.
Right.
Just
Yeah,
want to make
there's
sure.
a lot of the book that it just ended up kind of my style of writing, and I'm covering a lot of different concepts in the book. So a lot of the chapters are broken up into the digestible sections. So I wanted it to be information that people could read through and digest easily and be able to flip through and find passages easily as well.
And I think if you just look at the chapter, the other one thing that I really like is that if you look at the chapter, like the titles, it's actually what you talk about. And they're very easy to, like you said, it's simplified in the way that you're going exactly what you mean. It doesn't just say like the seven pillars of wisdom. And you're like, I don't even know what that means. Why would I using that? No, the chapter tells you what the chapter is going to be about, which is really cool.
Oh, cool.
So
Nice.
yeah, so I really like the action. Again, the items obviously I didn't do them all, but just to be truthful, but I did do a lot of them, and there was no, my inner critic is not Liz, but that's for conversation for outside of here. The other part that I really like is because I December is typically a bad month for me. And if, as my audience may know already, and if you haven't, here's some news. I had my grandmother died that in December. My father died in December. Me and my ex-wife went through miscarriage twice during December, among so many other things, and suicide of clients and stuff like that. So for me, December is just survive. This year was thankfully very busy with surgery, so I didn't think about it too much, which is, I guess, good. Um, but at the end of the day, I know that for me, December's is really hard, and I fucking hate the holidays. And your book spoke to me right away because on one of the chapters you talk about fuck the holidays, and it's not exactly the same as what I'm saying. So please, Liz does it much more eloquently than me. But Liz, can you tell me more about it?
Yeah. Well, in my book, I do have a section that's called Fa La 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 Fuck the Holidays because there's so much pressure that time of year. And if you love the holidays and you get a lot of joy and pleasure from the holidays, like I don't want to take that away from you. I think that's incredible and I think that's fantastic. But what I do want to impress upon individuals is that it's okay if the holidays are hard for you, and it's okay to have your holiday not look like everyone else's, and it's okay to interpret the holiday the way that you want to interpret the holiday, and that we don't have to box ourselves into spending money we don't have or going to activities we don't want to do or keeping up traditions just because it's a tradition. If those things, if you want to do these things and you have the resources, I mean, go for it. But I just want you to give you permission to be able to go through the holidays in a way that feels meaningful and joyful and calm for you, or that brings you a sense of like joy and peace and meaning. I don't want people to go through the holidays feeling stressed. And I also want to acknowledge too that if you're perplexed, hey, this all these great things are going on, I'm seeing family, I'm seeing friends, there's presents, there's all these things, but I'm still sad. Like, that's okay, that's normal, because these special days can really bring up can activate feelings of grief, of the fact that it's not the same that it was 5 years ago, or maybe you're dealing with financial constraints, or maybe you're dealing with the death of a loved one. And so when these special days come along, it can really activate feelings of grief and be really hard. And so if you are at a party and you're like, I should be enjoying this and you're not, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with you. That happens. And I want you to be kind and gentle with yourself if feelings of grief are activated during the holidays.
And what I like about it too is that it doesn't have to be just, December or November. It can be any holiday that triggers you. And, that's,
Right.
sorry for the
Yeah.
overgeneralization,
Birthdays are
but yeah.
right. Exactly. Birthdays, any holiday, any time of year that is significant for you. If you're experiencing some kind of a loss or a hardship, it can bring up really tough feelings.
And it's also kind of like, sometimes July 4th brings different things for people here in the United
Yeah,
States.
for sure. And I also think too that now with, I mean, there's always advertisements showing these like, very specific versions of what a family should look like, and showing someone who had, wealth and all of these things. And so, I mean, my entire life I've been, seeing these images on TV and commercials and advertising. But now we also have social media, and we have, we're seeing these influencers having these like beautiful, extravagant holidays, and it's so important to not compare yourself, because most people are not having a perfect holiday. And even those influencers that are showing that tiny glimpse of their life, they are likely not having a perfect holiday either. And
Well,
we
I
can't
think,
forget that.
yeah. And I remember years ago, I got annoyed with that Lexus commercial. And yes,
Yeah,
Lexus, I'm calling you out. Yes, I am. And I'm okay with that.
right.
But like Lexus commercial, like, oh, you know what? I know you're sad, but here's a 46,000. Well, now it's probably like in the 70s car
Hmm.
for with a big bow. And where the hell do you get those bows? I think you mentioned that in your book too, which I really
Right.
think is funny.
Yeah, absolutely. I did write about that in the, that commercial with like surprising someone with a car around the holidays. Like, that doesn't happen. Or maybe it does. Maybe, I'm sure it happens out there somewhere, but for the vast majority of people, we're not getting surprised by a car. So I think it's really helpful to just think about like, holidays are fun, but they're not, they can also just be days, right? They don't have to be this built up magical thing in our heads. They can be what we want it to be.
No, my daughter thinks she's going to get a car when she's 16 now. And she told me that she wanted one of those Jeep pickups. I don't even know the name of them.
Oh, like
And I'm
Jeep
like,
Wranglers or something
oh
like
no,
that.
there's a pickup in the back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's like, oh yeah, it starts at 45,000. I'm like, look, you're gonna start what I started with. You'll get a car. It's cheap, so that if you get into an accident, it doesn't really matter. So she'll
Right.
get a car. It just won't be a big bow, and it won't be a brand new one.
Exactly.
So I just wanted to share that because I think it's okay to accept that we don't have to do all that,
Right.
and I
For
really like
sure.
that. And I think you mentioned grief, and the other part that I really like is you talked about the types of grief. I've had several guests on my podcast talk about grief and trauma and all that, and because of my first responder experience, the one that really struck me in your book is you talk about cumulative grief. And I think that that's exactly what I talk about to a whole lot of people. But I'd like you to tell people more about what cumulative grief is all about.
Right. Cumulative grief essentially is like grief overload. It's when, I know during the pandemic, there were occasions where individuals in a family lost or had several family members die within a really short period of time. And it can be really hard to grieve all those losses at once. It's grief overload. So, when you're if you've experienced grief overload or cumulative grief, just acknowledging the fact that like you're dealing with multiple losses. And sometimes people have to even, one, this is absolutely a time to find whatever resources for support, leaning on friends and family and support groups and grief groups and books and whatever speaks to you in terms of finding an outlet for support. That's essential. But sometimes even, recognizing that maybe you might have to just kind of think about, okay, it's all right if I need to grieve this one at a time, or if, if I'm going to give myself permission for for whatever's coming up, right? You might think that like, oh, I should be impacted by this loss the most, but you might not. You might be impacted by another loss, or I talk with clients a lot about secondary losses, which is kind of the loss that follows the loss. And sometimes those can be just as distressing or, as the loss itself. So for example, if someone experiences the death of a close family member, you know, a secondary loss might be a loss of community or a loss of financial security or a loss of faith, and that can actually be almost as hard, if not harder, than the initial loss itself. And so, being honest with yourself and giving yourself permission to, do I need to grieve these losses one at a time? Do I need to acknowledge the secondary losses and recognize that's what's causing me the most distress? And also, how can I get support for
Right.
cumulative grief?
And then the loss of, secondary grief that we talk about, I really enjoy talking about that too, because I tell people like the losing my grandmother was a big loss, but losing the tightness of the family because she was the glue to the family. Now that was a much bigger
Right,
loss in some ways. My grandmother was suffering. And I'm not saying that I wish her dead, by the way. I'm just saying
right,
that I don't like watching people suffer. Uh,
right,
but then losing that whole family tightness, and there was not fight for anything. It was just like we just lost the tightness of our family, and that
right.
still affects.
Yeah, she played a really specific role in your family and keeping up certain traditions. And without her here, nobody knew, or it was a tough transition in terms of who takes that over. Does someone take that over? What does it look like now?
And it goes to the family now meeting, for funerals essentially, where when my grandmother was alive, we'd meet every week. I mean, I was gone. I was here in the United States. Obviously, my family's up in Montreal. But that secondary loss, and even going back up there and not having those traditions, is really like a hard one for a whole lot of people.
Right.
So I like to talk about those secondary losses because and the other part too is, what I think that you mentioned too is that, losing a pet is like losing a family member. And recently I've worked with someone who told me, well, I lost four people. Well, my dog too, but I don't count that. I'm like, no, that's a significant
You can
loss.
count that. Yeah, absolutely.
And the grief that
Yeah,
goes with that is tough.
right. And part of the reason I wanted to talk about grief is I work with a lot of individuals in their, a lot of college students, a lot of young adults, a lot of, people in their 20s and 30s. And I don't think we talk enough about the grief that comes from, people who graduate from high school and then go into the work world or go to college, and they're in this really specific environment for 4 years, and then they graduate and now they're living in a city or living in their hometown, and the fact that that's really can feel like a loss, that in college or in high school you're surrounded by people that are your same age, that are your same life stage. You're all kind of going through some similar experiences, and in high school and college you're learning all these things, and you're writing papers about things that you're passionate about, and you're learning from individuals who have these interesting specialties in the world, and then you graduate and then you get your first job, and it's hard. It's really
Hmm.
hard because you may not be surrounded by people that are your same age anymore. You might be living by yourself or with a roommate, or you might be doing things at work that are really boring, and it can really feel like a loss to make those transitions. And I don't think we talk about it enough, and so I wanted to talk about this idea of loss and these different types of losses. I used to work for the Went Center for Loss and Healing in DC, which is a bereavement counseling center, and they have some really amazing trainings. At one of their trainings they talked about anytime you have change plus loss, you can get grief, or you have grief that follows. And so sometimes when you're feeling off and you're not exactly sure why, or you're feeling a lot of different things, because grief isn't just one emotion, it's a whole ball of emotions, and it can feel like a roller coaster. So if you're feeling all sorts of things, irritability, sadness, disappointment, frustration, regret, you might be feeling grief. And so I wanted to bring different types of losses into the book, just so that, because it can be really helpful just to name it, like, oh, I'm feeling grief because I graduated and I'm in this new stage of life and I miss my old life, even though I might be excited about my new life.
I mean, like I'm going to mention something here and feel free not to go forward with it. I'm okay with that. But, when we work for both the same company that I don't mention just because I don't want to give it any credential, um, I was happy with my decision of leaving on my ethical standards and my principles, and I'll stand behind that any day of the week. But losing contact with, and you mentioned your Jarrell in your book, and you mentioned, I think of you. Eh, I'm Angie and Shannon, and I can name a whole lot of bunch of people that I work with. And, I never realized the grief that I had. Maybe it took me about 2 or 3 months after leaving. I'm like, I may never talk to these people again. And there was like, it's not only school. I think that even if you work for a job that you truly believe in, and
Right.
and shit happens. I mean, to me, like, and again, I mean this very sincerely. I was like, I'll probably never talk to Liz again, and I really did like you, but how are we going to keep in touch, right? And I'm happy we're in touch, but I share that as another type of grief too.
Yeah, absolutely. A job loss or a job change, that could be a huge loss. Retirement is a loss of structure, a loss of your social outlets, a loss of your colleagues. And that's why I think it's so important to talk about, because naming it at least and acknowledging it and acceptance, that I've experienced a loss. You don't have to like that you've experienced a loss. You don't have to love it. You don't have to look for the silver lining, but just accepting it, that this is what I'm feeling, can just kind of make you feel like you can breathe a little easier. Like naming it, right? Name it to tame it, right? So if you can name it, it's a little bit easier to be like, oh, okay, there's reasons for me to feel this way, and it's okay that I feel this way. And the minute you give yourself you acknowledge it and give yourself permission to feel it, it's easier to deal with at that point.
It's the stuff that I kind of remind myself too in different parts of my life, like this. As we probably, like, this will be released in March. I'm finishing up my indoor season of soccer with my daughter's team and coaching them, and then the outdoor season starts in April, and then by June, after doing 10 years of coaching, um, I'll be losing that. And it's interesting. I'm feeling myself a little teary about it. I'm happy to get rid of some of the freaking stress that goes with volunteering and the stuff that goes with that. Um, and part of me is also very sad because I see these girls, like I see them grow, and some of them I'll probably never see again. And I know I'm going to have some grief when that occurs. And I normalize it right away. It doesn't mean that it's wrong or right. It just means I
Right.
normalize it.
And it's still hard, even after you've named it and accepted it. I mean, it's still really hard, but at least that gives you the tools to be able to figure out how to go forward. And I'm very careful. I don't say move on. We don't move on from grief, but we move forward with it. That's actually something that Nora McInerney, she writes a lot about grief, and I think in her TED talk she talks about how we don't move on from grief, we move forward with it. And I think of it as like the goal is that over time, hopefully that grief becomes easier to carry. It's still with you, but it doesn't feel quite as heavy.
And I've had a guest on whose book is called Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go, which I also like because you can move on, doesn't mean you let go. And
Right.
I always talk about grief and trauma being this big old mountain in the middle, and we all like to circle it, but we don't like to climb it. And when we climb it, we're like, "Hey, I climbed it." I'm like, "Yeah, there's a downhill on the other side. That's as rough as climbing it." Actually, for me, it's harder to go down than going up.
Right.
So it's really, I use a lot of analogies in regards to grief and trauma, and your book really illustrates grief pretty well.
Thanks. Yeah. I
Go ahead.
wanted to, first talk about it and name it and acknowledge some losses that people may not have recognized as losses, and then just give some tools on how we move forward.
And I like all the tools, when there's a couple of things that you talk about the four pillars of meaning. And that's a deep writing journal shit. But the sense of belonging, transcendence, purpose, and storytelling. And for those of you who are on the podcast and not seeing the visual, yes, I looked down, I wrote them down, so it's not like I know them by heart. But I'd love to talk about more about those four pillars of meaning. It's from a TED Talk, right? It's
Right. Yeah. So yeah, and maybe you can link the TED Talk below yeah, so that people can visit it later because I want to make sure I get all the details right. So maybe afterwards we can link it. But yes, there's been research done and transcendence. So transcendence is really, getting a sense of having a sense of flow. It's that feeling where time sort of stops and that you're really kind of in the moment and you're present. So transcendence is like if you're cooking something and you're really into it and you're, got all your senses going and you're losing track of time and you're just really in the moment. That's that feeling. And I sometimes get that when I'm writing. I get that sometimes when I'm, making something, or if I'm drawing, you can kind of get that feeling. So wherever you can find that feeling, sometimes people find that when they're moving their bodies or exercising or playing a sport. So that's something that contributes to a meaningful life. And what was that? I want to make sure we go in order. What was?
The first one was belonging, which like
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
that I talk about it this way. The reason why AA, whether you can believe in it or not, I don't really care. I'm not an AA guy per se, but the one thing I know about AA is having that group and belonging goes a long way in your substance abuse or
Right.
controlling and getting into your recovery, or at least sobriety. But you want to
Right.
talk more about belonging? That's how I perceive it.
Yeah. So we are wired to belong. It goes back to, our survival, our caveman days, so basically, and back you know, in the caveman days, the people that belonged with their community had a much greater chance of survival. So, belonging is still uh, wired into us. And that's why we have our inner critic that is, trying to protect us so that we can maintain our belonging within our community and our families and our friends. And so we're really wired to want to belong. And so that also leads to meaning, is finding a sense of belonging. And it can take some work, but it's absolutely worth investing. And I think belonging requires a lot of authenticity. You have to be really honest about what do you like, what don't you like. I talk about in the book how I spent a couple years on my company softball team and I hate softball. I stink at softball. I don't like it.
It's a great
And
story.
so I had to get honest with myself. Like, this is not where I get a sense of belonging. And I think after a while I was like, listen, I'm just gonna bring the snacks. Cause like I was like, that I can do, like play softball, not so much, but when it comes to belonging, you have to be really honest about where do I feel like my most authentic self.
And, purpose is always hard. And, one of the things I think you debunk or maybe it's the TED Talk or both, I don't know. But purpose doesn't have to be like a straight line for the rest of your life. Purpose changes with time and situations. And I don't know if you want to talk more about that.
Yeah. I think sometimes we get all this pressure to like find your passion, and that's a lot of pressure. Um, so purpose I think can be feeling useful, feeling like you're taking care of your family, feeling like you are a good friend. You're when it comes to like purpose in your professional life. I love Cal Newport has an amazing book called So Good They Can't Ignore You. And one of the things he talks about in his book is that passion follows mastery. So you don't have to go out and find your passion and then get good at it and then make that your life's work. He said that, just be curious, figure out how you can be useful. And like the more you learn about something, the more that your passion is just going to automatically grow. Like the more you gain mastery over something, the more passionate you're going to naturally become, which I really loved because I think, this idea to find your passion is so much pressure. So I loved his book, and I love that like way to shift your view of what purpose is. So, your purpose doesn't have to relate to your job. It doesn't have to, it can be about the people in your life. It can be a lot of different things.
And I think it goes a little bit with storytelling. I call it your own narrative and your own narrator. You talk about the inner critic. I like the narrative view. How I perceive Steve doing a podcast right now with Liz, and I don't know what Liz thinks. I certainly know what I think. But I think the storytelling is all about like how it affects you. Because if I said to myself, Liz, and I don't mean this, doesn't like me. She's just doing this because she has to. And then suddenly my attitude might be like, all right, why don't you talk about storytelling there, Miss Smarty Pants? And of course, the storytelling is a little more than narrative, but that's really what I got from that. I don't know what you want to
Right.
say about it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think of storytelling as, how can you look at your experiences in a way that feels empowering versus, you can, I mean, the reality is subjective, right? We can
Right.
look at reality in a million different ways, and storytelling really speaks to, if you were going to make a movie about your life, if it was like Steve, the story of, like, what would your movie title be, or Liz, the story of, and what would that be? And you want to, and so I think of storytelling as looking at your experiences and looking at who you are and what you do in a way that feels empowering, as opposed to looking at it in a way that's going to bring you down
Yeah. And
or
that,
diminish you.
and that's what, that's where Nelson takes over also, right?
Right, exactly. Because Nelson is going to want to tell the story in a way that brings us down and keeps us small, or keeps me small. And so storytelling is being able to put Nelson in his place so that I can tell the story in a way that is going to, help me move forward, um, in a manner that's aligned with my values, right?
That's why I talked to my inner critic and explained the difference between being humble and putting me down. And so I've learned to be more humble versus being put down.
Right. Yeah. I love that.
The one thing the other thing that I loved about your book that fucking soulmates. I so don't believe in soulmates myself, because I think that's a Hallmark movie.
Right.
Uh, but you talk a little bit about that dream that we have a soulmate or whatever.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about that too?
Sure. So there's a section of the book on relationships, and it's certainly not the end all be all. It's one chapter. It's
It
not,
is the end all
it's
that
the
be all. She
basics.
is lying. If don't read anything else. I'm kidding, everyone. I'm kidding.
But I did put in the book that I think we should rethink this idea of soulmates, because the problem with soulmates is that if you think there's one person out there for you, and it's, and you meet that person, and then all of a sudden you might start to justify things that aren't okay, that, or even abusive, right? Or you might start to sweep red flags under the rug because you're like, oh, well, this person, the way they speak to me is unkind, or they're isolating me from my friends, but this is my soulmate, right? Or it could also lead to codependency, this idea of like, I can't live without this person, I can't, I need this person to be able to function in my life, or and so this idea of, I absolutely, believe in romantic love, and I, value my spouse, and all these things, but I like the idea of being interdependent. Like, I'm an independent individual, you're an independent individual, and together we choose to combine our lives in a way that works for both of us. And so, so there's a section in the book that talks about that, sort of asks you to rethink this idea of soulmates, because I think it can lead to, thinking that's not going to be the healthiest.
I think you talk about attachment too in that chapter, if I remember correctly.
Right. Yeah, and there's a lot of great books out there on attachment. So I just touched on it briefly, but attachment is, how we connect with other people, and healthy attachment is, feeling like, uh not being nervous about, your connection. Like, you can go off with your friends and know that, like, this person is still there for you, right? You don't have to seek constant validation of what your connection is with this other person. So yeah, I just wanted to give a brief introduction to attachment in the book.
But I think that that's a great way to kind of like talk a little bit about your book in general. I said this at the beginning. I'll say it again. That's exactly what your book is. It takes a lot of these big books principles. Like I said, I can buy 25 books. Probably wouldn't get as much as I got in that one book because it talks about you know, is it 20 pages each? No, but it gives you the bubble talk process. And then you give
Right.
some examples that go with that. So I think it's such a healthy book for people to get. I think it's healthy for everyone to kind of pay attention to that stuff. And if they want to do more deep dives, so to speak, I think your book is a good place to go from that to deep dive or hopefully afford therapy.
Right. That's my hope is that if someone reads this book, this is an introduction to a lot of concepts that are talked about in therapy and in the mental health space. If you see something in the book like, attachment or codependency or, something that, or grief, if you're like, oh my goodness, this really strikes a nerve, or I'm curious about this, I hope that this book, will now give you the language or the tools or be like, oh, maybe I do need to know more about this, or I do want to read more about this. And then, after reading, this book, you could, or my book, this book is cheaper than therapy, that then you'll be able to be like, I want to learn more about grief, or maybe I need to join a grief support group, or maybe I need to learn more about attachment, or maybe I need to learn about more about how to regulate my nervous system, and so hopefully it'll kind of give you a jumping off point on where to go next.
I think it's a great jumping off point for a whole lot of different things. I really appreciated the book overall, for real. And I think that what I hope people get too is that what Liz talked about in that book, that's what she does. This is stuff that, again, like I said, I feel like you were eavesdropping into my conversations, because that's a lot of the stuff that I talk about with my clients every day. And so I don't say that just to be nice, but she doesn't say, your IFS should be really combined with DBT so that your CBT can make more sense with your psychoanalytic. Like, no, there's no like jargon BS that we do. And frankly, I
Right.
don't like myself. That's why I do this podcast. It's really meant to be explained really well. And, as this podcast will be released, it will be the following week on March 19th, 2024. Your book will be released. So it'd be
Right.
great if you told us a little bit of where we can get it, where we can buy it, stuff like that.
Sure, absolutely. So it's the publisher is Bridge City Books. So you can go to Bridge City Books, the website, which is they're an imprint of Pessy. And it's also being sold on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and wherever books are sold. Also, on March 19th, there's going to be an electronic version and an audio version. So, if you are someone who likes to listen to your books, that will be available. If you want to get it sent to your Kindle or wherever you want to read it, you can get an electronic version. But it's available for pre-sale now. So if you want to get your hard copy, I would love that. And of course, authors are incredibly grateful for anyone who takes the time to leave a thoughtful, honest review. So I really appreciate all the folks who have done that or who might consider that in the future.
We were talking before the podcast, and I said to you that, to me, writing a book was nothing compared to the editor and doing the editing. But I think the most important thing, this is going to show you who Liz is truly. She's like, yeah, but you know what? It's putting your soul out there, putting yourself out there. That's the hardest part. And I certainly agree with that too. And I thought that was just the essence of how great of a human being Liz truly is.
Well, thank you. I'm incredibly flattered, and likewise, I think you are a stellar human being as well, and I'm so grateful for the fact that you have this podcast and put these concepts out into the world and make mental health more accessible. I think the two of us have the same motivation, right? I'm incredibly grateful to all those to the individuals doing research and and in academia and I'm so grateful to all those individuals. And what I hope to do is to be a little bit of a translator or connector, right, between the academic and the research base and the general public who's like, well, how do I feel better? And I want to be that connector
And that's our
or that translator.
archetypes. It's our archetypes. That's a different type of psychoanalytic stuff that you can look into, but that's not in the book. It's just a conversation we're having. But
Right.
but Liz, I meant every word I said. You've known me long enough. Hopefully, I don't BS. And the people who listen to me know that. So go buy, pre-order the book now, whether it's audio, the electronic version, or the actual hard copy. I love the hard copy. I'm hoping that at one point I'm get a signed one from you. Uh,
Yeah, you bet. Absolutely.
and at the end of the day, I just want to say that forget about the book. It's just as a human being, I truly appreciate you. But go get that book. I tell you right now, if you want to learn how about therapy works in about 250 pages, give or take, it's absolutely the book for you. So thank you, Liz.
Thanks. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to get to talk about the book and talk about mental health with you. And would love to chat with you anytime.
Well, you know what? Maybe one day we should have a bunch of authors all together and we can commiserate of how difficult it is for a therapist to write books.
Let's do it.
All right. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks.
Well, this completes episode 143. Liz Kelly, just an interesting conversation again. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. And I can't wait, hopefully, we'll talk privately, but maybe we'll have you back on at some point. But episode 144 was another former colleague from that company, Ivana Colangelo. And I can't wait to talk to her. She's going to talk about relationships, and I'm going to have her on next episode. And I hope to see you then.
Please like, subscribe, and follow this podcast on your favorite platform. A glowing review is always helpful. And as a reminder, this podcast is for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only. If you're struggling with a mental health or substance abuse issue, please reach out to a professional counselor for consultation. If you are in a mental health crisis, call 988 for assistance. This number is available in the United States and Canada.